Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 529. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today, joined by Dave DeCamp. Dave, how you doing?
I'm good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, good to have you here, Dave. Dave is, of course, the news editor at antiwar.com. And so, we talk about yourself all the time on the show, Dave. Everybody's familiar with you. I feel like I really don't have to introduce you here. I think you've probably been on the show more than anybody else other than Connor Freeman. So, welcome back. Happy to have you here. I got a couple questions for you about some news stories that you wrote just today and last night, but then I also want to ask you some questions on some bigger picture stuff. And I guess actually the first article of yours that I have kind of gets into one of those questions, which is, what is Israel doing in Gaza? Not just over, not what have they done, what are their forces currently doing, but if we look, say, 2 weeks, a month down the road, Dave, what is Israel going to be doing here? You wrote this article for antiwar.com, January 15th. Israeli defense minister says intensive phase of ground offensive in North Gaza is over. So what's happening here, and what do you think?
Yeah, so it's not clear exactly what's happening on the ground in Gaza, but what he's saying is that, and the Israeli officials have said this before, that they're basically winding things down in North Gaza to focus on the south. Well, he said that that's been done, so the intensive phase in the north is over. They're claiming that they've taken out Hamas leadership in North Gaza and that they're only fighting pockets of resistance now. But it does still seem like there's, again, it's hard to gauge, but I see Hamas put out these videos of the fighting on the ground. It does look like there's still some pretty fierce fighting going on. And then in the south, there's still, but they've, destroyed most of the buildings in North Gaza. I mean, they really leveled the place, and that's what they're doing in the south. This is something the U.S. has been asking Israel to do, is kind of go to more targeted operations rather than just indiscriminate bombing and heavy ground forces. And Blinken, when he was just in Israel, that was one thing he said he was going to try to do. And while he met with Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, who made these comments, Gallant said that they're intensifying operations in the south, and then they have since in Khan Yunis and near Rafah, where most of the Palestinians are now because they've all been pushed out of the north. So it's a really horrible situation for the people in the south. 2 weeks, a month from now, it's hard to say, if this is going to translate into them really winding things down. I mean, there's a chance, because they said they pulled some ground forces out of North Gaza, that they just kind of focus more on airstrikes rather than the ground campaign. We'll just kind of have to see how it plays out.
So, Dave, when I'm kind of looking at the situation in Gaza at this point, it seems that there is maybe roughly a third to a quarter of the Gaza Strip that hasn't been heavily bombarded by Israel. Certainly, even all regions of Gaza have been bombed some. But there is some, infrastructure and housing remaining in some areas of Rafah and things like this. So, if Israel stopped bombing today, my concern is that by just restricting aid, they're essentially going to force the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And so, have you seen any indication on what the Israeli plan is on allowing aid into Gaza, or are they just going to restrict the aid, and that's essentially going to be their stranglehold at this point, with what, maybe 10% of Gazans still in their homes? I've seen, estimates 85-90% people are displaced now, at least, and they always say at least once, because a lot of people have been displaced multiple times at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, because another thing that Blinken said, that they want Israel to let the Palestinians who were evacuated from North Gaza return to their houses. Israel says they're not going to do that unless it's part of some hostage deal or something. But what do they have to go back to? I mean, in the north, it's been just decimated. And there's no infrastructure or anything. So yeah, if they're not getting aid or any, there's no work. Obviously, the economy is completely destroyed in Gaza, more so than it was before. So if they do restrict aid, which it seems like that's part of the plan here, as we've seen them increasing, adding restricted items to the list, and then you had that senator that which you covered. What was it, Van Hollen? Is that his name?
Right.
Saying that Israel, basically they'll inspect a truck and they'll find one thing and say, "Oh, that's it. It can't go in." Um, so yeah, I think it's just part of their strategy to make the Gaza Strip unlivable and uninhabitable. And they're just hoping eventually some countries say, "All right, open up to the Palestinian refugees and start taking them in." And then, that clearly seems to be their strategy here. You've seen Netanyahu try to say that that's not what they want to do. They don't want to displace the Palestinians, but that's clearly just kind of a cleanup job, PR purposes, because the U.S. Has been critical of, Ben-Gvir and the other ministers in Israel that are saying it more matter of factly that that's what they want to do. So yeah, I think right now, I mean, Netanyahu's strategy is just full steam ahead for as long as we can. Let's do this for as long as we can until the U.S. I think you would think it doesn't seem like Biden is even thinking about this at all, but you would think if this thing's still going on in a month, 2 months at this level, I mean, something's got to give here with all this international pressure. But no, it seems like Biden there's a lot to get into here, but they're just dedicated to supporting whatever Israel's going to do in Gaza, and they'll do anything, even if it means, huge regional war, just full steam ahead. So I think that's Netanyahu's thinking, is just let's keep going as hard as we can for as long as we can, basically.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you kind of make a good point there, Dave. Like if we get to a month and a half, 2 months down the road from now, we're already talking about 70% of houses in Gaza bombed over the course of 3 months. And so, at that pace over the course of 5 months, that would essentially be all of Gaza. And so then you would have to tone down your operations just due to a lack of possible structures to hit, right? I mean, they would, end up just dumping bombs on empty Gazan territory. Maybe they'll bomb the farmlands, which I did see. I believe it was the information minister of Israel said that she thinks that 60% of the Gazan farmland will become a buffer zone or be unusable after
Mhm.
these operations are over. So, that's just horrific. And all right, so my next question here is, Dave, is Biden going to curtail the aid at some point? We that same senator Van Hollen from Maryland also said, and this is in the Aaron Mate article that I believe is running as the spotlight today on antiwar.com. When you hear this, it should still be up there as a spotlight. And what Mate highlights that this senator said is that, Netanyahu keeps giving the finger to Biden. And this is something that I kind of wrote up when I summarized Antony Blinken's trip to the Middle East, and particularly his visit to Israel. Everything the U.S. and the White House asked for, the Netanyahu administration said that they're not going to abide by, or that they're not going to follow. And, Dave, it would be one thing if it was just the past 3 months. But if you think, back to the beginning of the Biden administration, was what, 2 or 3 months into his administration in April, when the Biden administration was trying to restart talks with Iran, and the Israelis started attacking Iranian ships and carrying out assassinations inside Iran, and really undermining the negotiations that the U.S. was trying to have with Iran to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. And so this, at some point, does Biden take offense?
I mean, you would think so. It especially, it just doesn't seem like he cares right now. I think as the re-election stuff continues, I mean, you got to think there's all this dissent within the administration from Democrats within his own, campaign staffers against what he's doing here. And I think, we've seen it a few times now. His speeches get disrupted by protesters. He's going to Michigan soon, I think, and there's a lot of Arabs in Michigan. I mean, I could see that being a complete disaster for him. Lots of protesters, not just a small group. So I think as that stuff, I bet this is if he goes around campaigning, I wouldn't be surprised if we see disruptions at like every speech. This is like significant dissent that's happening. And you think at some point he would, because he could probably take some more symbolic measures to placate a lot of people and just publicly like do something, say something, or just restrict one thing and say, look, we're doing like there's measures that they can take limited, but they could still support it, but at least kind of make it seem like they're doing something. But he's not even doing that. I mean, it's really unbelievable.
Well, maybe that's a good time to talk about this article that you wrote yesterday. Biden ignores Palestinian deaths in statement on 100 days of war in Gaza. It seems like this would have been a pretty trivial thing. And I believe, I know the second staffer, the education department staffer who resigned over this, but I believe both of the staffers who resigned cited Biden's claiming and downplaying the number of deaths in Gaza as part of the reason that they were resigning. So, this seems like kind of a basic thing, just acknowledging that there's death in Gaza, and Biden almost refuses to do it.
Yeah, yeah. He put out this statement, 100 days of war. It was really 100 days since the hostages were taken. That's how the statement was framed. But yeah, I mean, this whole long statement saying nobody should have to endure what these 100 Israelis are going through, including there's 6 Americans there. And yeah, I mean, again, just public relations purposes, mention the Palestinians, mention the American citizens in Gaza who live there. I know some have gotten out, but I believe there's still a lot in Gaza. I mean, just like something. It is kind of amazing to me how like cold-blooded he's being publicly about this. You know, when the protesters disrupted his speech at that church in South Carolina, he said something like, "Oh, I've been working behind the scenes to get Israel to, significantly reduce its forces." But again, no actual pressure, and still no. Yeah, there's a lot of Palestinians dying. That's sad. Like nothing like that. And then you have John Kirby, just a complete sociopath, who's basically the White House spokesman on this. It's not what's her name. He's handling all kind of the questions about this.
Well,
Just
it's
saying,
not surprising, right? Why, right? Like they actually need an effective spokesperson now. Like this is, what I mean.
yeah,
There has to be some acknowledgement in the White House that they're in a little bit of trouble, that they have the professional doing the job here.
yeah, and he's just, I mean, this is going to be an interesting thing to study in the future for historians when it's not gonna history is not gonna look kindly on this administration. And some of the things that Kirby has said, I mean, just again, completely like cold-blooded, saying, yeah, thousands of innocent people have been killed. That's part of this. It's gonna keep happening. What are you gonna do, basically? And then before that, he cried on TV when he was asked about Israelis who were killed during October 7th. He got teary-eyed at one point when he was over at the Pentagon talking about Ukrainian civilians being killed. I mean, it's just sick stuff. He even said at one point that nobody's done more for the Palestinians than the U.S. government. I mean, again, just looking back and kind of collecting these things, it's just really unbelievable the way that they're handling this. And the State Department spokesmen, like their responses are just really pathetic. Like it seems like they're not even really trying to placate the people. The dissent seems like they're just kind of giving them the finger. I mean, not even acknowledging really how horrific this whole thing is.
Yeah. And, it's kind of wild, Dave. You'll see in, when the U.S. makes a request, so Blinken goes to Israel and asks them to release the tax money they're withholding from the Palestinian Authority. The Israeli finance minister goes on X and says, with all due respect to the United States, this isn't your war. And then just a couple days later, Netanyahu apparently told Blinken that this is your war while he was in Israel. And so, it does almost insult you. Like I am not like a particularly like, American flag waving, like, triumph our, military and our world prowess or anything like that. But this does seem a little bit insulting, Dave. And, as somebody, you would think American firsters would be kind of particularly insulted by the way Israel is really just defying anything the U.S. asked for. But it doesn't seem like we're seeing much of that. I want to ask about, and one of the things I think that Israel has in mind here, Dave, is that the war may expand over the next month or so, and at which point what is happening in Gaza isn't going to be so important if the U.S. is involved in major operations in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Lebanon. I mean, this is all absolutely horrible to even think about. So yesterday I went on Twitter and I saw that Iran had attacked the U.S. in Iraq, and I was really concerned. And then I talked to you about it, and it looks like that wasn't the right story, guys. So Dave, what actually happened? Where did Iran conduct attacks? What did they allegedly hit?
Yeah, so first, you make a good point, that if this thing does really explode into like a full-blown war between the US and Iran, which I think there's still a long way to get there, but the US could really ramp things up in Yemen to a point, to a really high point. And then Netanyahu will probably be more free of public scrutiny to do whatever he wants in Gaza. But anyway, so these strikes in Iraq, yeah, so that was the first I saw on Twitter, people saying Iran bombed the U.S. consulate in Erbil, Iraq, which is in the northern Kurdistan region. And, you see a lot of stuff on Twitter that spreads like that when stories first break that turns out not to be the case. And then it was pretty clear quickly that they were targeting, they've done this before, as you know, again, they targeted Erbil, Iraq, near the U.S. consulate. And this is something that they bombed back in 2022 in response to an Israeli attack on an Iranian drone facility inside Iran. They bombed this area of Erbil, and they said they were targeting a secret Mossad base. And that's what they said happened this time as well. It seemed like it was a bigger attack. They said they targeted like 3 sites. A lot of ballistic missiles were fired. They also said they bombed ISIS in Syria, more ballistic missile strikes there. But the thing in Iraq was very concerning because it was near the U.S. consulate, but the U.S. said no U.S. facilities were damaged, no injuries or anything. So this is in response to the attacks on ISIS, are a response to the bombing that happened in Kerman, Iran recently during the commemoration for Soleimani, the Iranian general who the U.S. killed in a drone strike. In 2020, there was a big suicide bombing. 94 people were killed. ISIS took responsibility. Iran bombed ISIS in Syria. And then in Iraq, it's not clear exactly what this was a response to. I would assume that Israel killed basically Iran's main highest level IRGC officer that's based in Syria. Israel killed them in an airstrike back in at the end of November. So that's probably the retaliation. And now, is there really a secret Mossad base that they bombed? Not clear exactly. But as you helped me find, back in 2022, when they bombed a building in that same area, a U.S. official told the New York Times that building was, I forget the exact wording, but the building was used as an Israeli intelligence, training.
Outpost and training facility.
Yeah, outpost and training facility. And then they had other officials basically acknowledge that Israel has launched intelligence operations against Iran from Iraqi Kurdistan. So there is definitely Israeli operatives and intelligence assets in Kurdistan. They killed, I believe, 4 people who the Kurdish regional government said were civilians. One was a businessman. I believe Iran alleges he was some sort of Mossad operative. I don't know how true any of that is, but that's just what the different sides are saying. So, yeah, the Iraqi government's not happy about this. They're not happy with the U.S. airstrikes. They're not happy with the Iranian airstrikes. They just seem to always get caught in the middle of these things. Everybody just bombs Iraq when they don't want to bomb each other directly.
Yeah, so now what latest updates on what's happening with Yemen. I think just before we went on the air here, Dave, you published this article for antiwar.com. Apparently the U.S. is launching more airstrikes against the Houthis. So this would be the 3rd round, I believe.
Yeah, this is the 3rd round since early Friday morning. The U.S. and the U.K. launched that big kind of missile barrage across Houthi-controlled Yemen. And then I believe you wrote up the next one. Was that early Sunday morning or early Saturday morning?
It was early Saturday morning, just about 24 hours after the first strikes.
Yeah, the U.S. said that they hit a radar site that they missed or something in the first barrage. And so this happened Tuesday morning. CENTCOM said that they hit Houthi ballistic missiles that were preparing to launch an attack on ships in the Red Sea. And then just a few hours after that, the Houthis did end up hitting a Greek-owned ship with a missile that the Houthis said was going to Israel. So I mean, it just goes to show. I mean, and just from what the history in Yemen and what the Houthis faced from the Saudi bombing campaign, the U.S. backed Saudi UAE bombing campaign, that basically just made them stronger. And now, so these like limited airstrikes in Yemen, I mean, they're not really limited. I guess they did launch some pretty big ones in that first round, but it's not going to do anything to stop the Houthis and U.S. officials acknowledge this to the New York Times that yeah, their offensive capabilities, remain intact. We didn't do much damage to them. They have a lot of mobile weapons, and it's just they're it's just escalating the situation. They're targeting U.S. ships now, commercial vessels. They weren't doing that before. More big shipping companies are shutting down transits through the Red Sea. It's just made the situation much more worse and much more volatile.
Yeah, David, it seems very hard to imagine that the US and UK, even though they have more military capabilities than Saudi Arabia does, would have the stomach to conduct a more brutal war than Saudi Arabia did against the Houthis. And of course, the US was providing Saudi Arabia intelligence for at least a good part of that war. So I don't see any reason why the US and UK would be any more effective than the Saudis in fighting against the Houthis. And if anything, the Houthis just kind of perfected their tactics in disguising, their missiles from Western intelligence sources and things like that over the years against Saudi Arabia. And certainly the US probably is always developing their capabilities, and they'll figure out how to hit certain targets, and the Houthis will, figure out how to hide them. But this doesn't seem like a long-term sustainable project here for the US. The missile defenses that they fire to intercept the Houthi missiles are very expensive. It's, of course, pretty strenuous on the Navy to constantly have all those ships that constantly need to be resupplied in that region of the world, especially when they're trying to fight everybody else too, maybe even North Korea, Dave. So this is it really just doesn't seem like something that could even possibly be winnable for the U.S. And yet you have this major escalation going on here. It's quite baffling to me, I guess. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really trying to wrap my head around it, like what their strategy is here. I mean, unless they like really launch a war, like a full-blown war against the Houthis, all this is going to do is kind of, I mean, obviously that would escalate things as well, but I mean, this is just kind of almost emboldening the Houthis to say, no, you can't stop us. We're going to keep going here. And, that's that. And just turning the area into a much more dangerous area than it was. And it's amazing to see the Saudis urging restraint. I mean, that's really something to see just after how many years of the Saudis just destroying Yemen and begging the U.S. to keep supporting them in that horrible war. It really goes to show, I think, kind of the change in the Saudis' calculation in the past couple of years. They sued for peace with the Houthis. They opened up with Iran. They opened up with Syria. They just seems like they really decided, all right, let's focus on diplomacy here instead of war. This has not worked out for us. And the Houthis being able to hit their oil facilities was a huge part of that, them making that decision. But yeah, I mean, it just shows how insane all of this is, that the Saudis are like, whoa, take it easy
And
here in Yemen.
and I think it probably shows what may even be the primary, but is certainly going to be a secondary effect for the Houthis here, as well as interrupting the Israeli and now U.S. and probably UK linked shipping going through the Red Sea. I think they're making a real play here for to at least get regional legitimacy for their movement. I feel like it's going to be very hard now for Saudi Arabia or the UAE to take action against Yemen, because it's going to be seen as fighting a war on behalf of Israel. And I think certainly probably just culturally, this could be something that could, really make the Houthis, somewhat of a legendary movement, first standing up to the American sock puppets and Ali Abdullah Saleh and winning multiple wars against him, and then winning a war against Saudi Arabia, and now holding out against the U.S. again. That's certainly a narrative that the Houthis are going to be able to spin and make a lot of propaganda out of. And, even though a lot of these Arab governments aren't necessarily responsive to public pressures and things like that, they rule over a lot of their citizens with a fairly iron fist. At the same time, they can't do things that are too drastically unpopular and too many drastically unpopular things. And certainly picking a fight with an Arab movement defying what they see as, the U.S. and Israeli imperial regime is, I think, going to be a hard sell in most of the Middle East at this point. And that's probably going to be pretty big and significant, I think, Dave. So I don't know. Do you have anything on that before I ask you something else?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that's their whole play here. The Houthis are the ones, portraying themselves as the only ones really sticking up for the Palestinians in the region. And yeah, they're trying to just really make a name for themselves. And the U.S. is kind of playing right into it right now.
Yeah. So, all right, Dave, let's talk about some other, areas, pockets of resistance here. And I particularly want to talk about Iraq and Syria, where I mean, the policy of the Biden administration almost makes me sick, because essentially we just have the Biden administration using the U.S. troops as sponges for Israeli anger in the Middle East. These groups keep conducting these attacks, and fortunately nobody has been killed yet. Now, somebody did die, I believe, from like a cardiac issue, in proximity to one of these strikes, and so that's an issue here. But it certainly seems to me, Dave, that this is basically just the Biden administration allowing these groups to blow off steam that they have against Israel and what they're doing in Gaza. And so, this is just another way U.S. is paying the price for the Israeli genocide.
Yeah, it is another thing. It's hard to wrap your head around, because now you have Iraq saying that they want the U.S. to leave. But no, they're determined to stay. They're not going to give up that presence, and they have a lot of power over Iraq. They could basically just destroy their economy. So yeah, they're basically just sitting ducks in these bases in Iraq and Syria. And it's all over. This is all over Israel. This big part of the reason why the U.S. is still in Iraq and Syria is for Israel, is to push against, Iran's influence and presence in the region. So you see, there's a story up today about the New Jersey National Guard, getting ready to deploy to this area, where they're going to be under constant attack. And it looks like, as far as I can tell, it seems like it's a regular troop rotation. I don't think the U.S. is sending reinforcements. But anyway, the report on this is from CBS News, and it didn't mention these attacks. It just kind of portrayed this as a deployment against ISIS. But I mean, they're going basically, sending these New Jersey guardsmen to potentially die or get hurt for Israel. I mean, that's what it's all about. That these attacks started, the Shia militias in Iraq that are behind most of these. They're kind of making it not clear exactly which groups are responsible, but it's kind of a coalition, and they have attacked the U.S. before. They've wanted the U.S. out for a long time. And they're definitely taking advantage of the regional tensions. But these current waves of attack started in response to the U.S. support for what Israel's doing in Gaza. And during the week-long truce, when the hostage deal happened, the attacks stopped. I believe there was just one rocket fired at a base that didn't land anywhere near it. But that goes to show that's what this is about. So, yeah, and Biden's bombed Syria and Iraq several times now.
Yeah. All right, Dave. So before we wrap up here, I just have one last question I want to ask you about Taiwan. They just had an election. And so what, just, in general, you don't have to get into too much detail here, but, what do you feel like, is kind of going to be the results of that election for, as far as, U.S. policy, Taiwan, China goes?
Yeah, so I didn't pay enough attention to the election. I really wanted to follow it closely, but with everything that's been happening, it was hard to. But yeah, so the DPP, the ruling party, their candidate won. The current vice president of Taiwan won the election. They lost the legislature, which could make it hard for them to push through new laws. But basically, this party, that the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, they're more independence minded than the Kuomintang, which is the main opposition party. And then this year, you also had the Taiwan's People's Party, which is a relatively new party. I think they just formed in 2019, but they were a real contender in this election, but they came in third. But the Kuomintang and even the TPP were assumed that if they came in, they would try to ease tensions with mainland China. The DPP, their strategy has been move closer to the U.S., move closer to the West, get more military diplomatic support. And so that means we're going to see more of that, kind of more of the same. At the same time, I think a lot of people might think this means Taiwan's going to declare independence. I don't think that's going to happen, even though they say they're a de facto independent country. It's everybody knows that if they formally declare independence from China, that basically means war with China. So I don't see them doing that, but I think it's going to be more in this direction. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think there might be a chance that the U.S. might, hit the brakes a little bit with their Taiwan strategy, considering everything that's happening in the Middle East. But I think they're still going to go in this direction of giving them more military and diplomatic support. That's going to anger China. It's the most sensitive issue for China. The U.S. and Chinese militaries are talking again, which I guess dialogue is good. But in these conversations, you see China always say, Taiwan, Taiwan. It's the big thing. It's the first red line that must never be crossed is something they always say. So that means that they're still not happy with what the U.S. is doing there. I mean, they're never going to be happy with what they're doing, but they're still really poking and prodding the China over Taiwan.
Right. And the U.S. is stoking over the Philippines too, Dave. You would think at somewhere they would leave it
Yeah.
go, but
I actually think right now the Philippines seems almost more volatile. What's happening in the South China Sea?
yeah,
There's these encounters like all the time, these collisions and stuff near these disputed rocks and reefs, and the U.S. is just emboldening the Philippines to do this and saying, if things get out of control, don't worry, we got your back against China. I mean, it's insane saying that they'll intervene directly if Philippine boats in the South China Sea come under attack. If the Philippines did not have that backing, there's no way that they would be as aggressive as they are, pushing back against China's claims. So yeah, that's definitely a really dangerous situation.
yeah. All right, Dave. Well, thank you so much for returning to the show today. Everybody really, I'm pretty sure everything myself or Dave DeCamp does is at antiwar.com. His show has like this nice little spot on the front page of the site there. So if you go to antiwar.com, you just click there and listen to Dave's show every day. If you click through the video, you could get to his YouTube page and subscribe to his show. Make sure you like the videos, help him out that way. And then you're at DeCamp Dave on Twitter, where you post a lot of stuff other than what you write, although I'm sure most of what you end up posting you do talk about on your show. And you write several articles every day which are on the news section of antiwar.com. So Dave, thank you so much for returning to the program. We'll have to have you back soon.
Yeah, Kyle, thanks for having me.